Okay. All right, yeah. So like I said, the notes yesterday. Sorry about that. I got some videos in here. Hopefully, I don't run into a copyright infringement issue. All right. If I do, I'll do what I did with the kind of videos from yesterday. So this was the last slide from yesterday. So you don't need to type this out. All right, you should already have it at least. So, like I said, yesterday with chapter 8, we're heading back east. We're talking in Chickadee, China, which you guys know today is the start of the Chinese Lunar Year, New Year. It's the year of the ox, which last year was the year of the rat, which makes kind of sense, I guess. So, like, we're going to go to China. We're going to, go to Mongolia, dip back into China next week. Japan, Korea, back into South Asia, and then Southeast Asia to end it. All right, so like I said, the last time that you guys were with me last time we talked about Chinese history was chapter 3, and we were kind of talking about the whole concept of dynasties and how historians like to divide kind of Chinese periods into the kind of dynastic rule there. So like in chapter 3, the last dynasty, we talked about the Han Dynasty, one of the golden ages in Chinese history. But what you find here periodically that things tend to repeat themselves in Chinese history to a certain extent, and usually these kind of transitions between dynasties. What they call the Mandate of Heaven, which was kind of created by the Zhou dynasty, that concept, are these kind of civil wars that are multifaceted, kind of they last at times hundreds of years, all right, where we don't find one state or one family dominating. So after the fall of the Han dynasty in 220, it wasn't until towards the end of the 6th century, the 580s, where we see kind of China unify again. So we talked about the Sui dynasty yesterday. The Sui dynasty is often compared to the Qin, because both are kind of short ruling dynasties, right? Thank you. They're both short ruling. The only other dynasty that rules shorter than the Sui or the Qin, and they both leave behind these big kind of public works projects. Like for the Qin, the most famous thing was the Great Wall of China. Do you remember for the Sui? If you got to watch the notes yesterday, what was the big public works thing that they built? And it's like a waterway that connects the Yellow and the Yangtze River. It's a canal. It's pretty grand, so they called it the Grand Canal. It's today it basically stretches about 1,700 miles connecting Beijing to the southern city of Hangzhou. At the time of the Sui, it was about 1,200 miles. All right, but this was very important economically. It kind of combined the two areas. All right, unfortunately though, for the Sui, they spent a lot of money on it. All right, it's about 6 years to build. Usually people were conscripted, kind of drafted either into building public works projects or the military. And the Sui spent a lot of money on military campaigns, particularly in Korea, that were very unsuccessful. So how do you kind of pay for those things, those public works projects and the kind of the wars and stuff like that? How generally countries pay for that?
Like labor?
Well, not necessarily labor. Some people paid for their lives, right? With labor. But how do you? I mean, what do you do to generate that revenue to pay for those taxes, right? Okay. So for the Sui, they implemented a heavy tax system of taxation. That's usually a kind of a recipe for disaster when you have in Chinese history when you issue these heavy taxes without providing a whole lot of services. So the Sui dynasty is going to give away. They're going to lose the Mandate of Heaven to the Tang dynasty, which is like the Han, one of the golden ages. It's often compared to the Han dynasty. The Tang dynasty became very wealthy through trade, in particular the reopening of what trade route that connected east and west. We talked about in chapter 3. Silk Road. Boom, good. All right. So for a while there, the Tang dynasty was able to use the revenue from the Silk Road and controlling posts in Western China into Central Asia. All right. So they were able to kind of generate revenue by that way, so they didn't have to kind of issue heavy taxation on their citizens. After the Battle of Talas, though, that starts to change slowly. All right. And again, what ends up happening is the Tang dynasty loses the Mandate of Heaven. There's another civil war period referred to as the Wu Day period, although they like to refer to it as well as the 5 Dynasties, 10 Kingdoms period. Now, compared to other the Warring States period, just a relatively short civil war, about 30 years, right? And then that gives way to the dynasty that we'll talk about today, the Song dynasty. Right? The Song dynasty was the dynasty that basically reunifies China after the Wu Day period. All right? There's some continuation culturally, politically, economically with the Tang dynasty. The one exception maybe is that the Song don't have control over trade posts along the Silk Road. All right, but it is still very wealthy. Still, the Grand Canal kind of provides for that. for that. Well, population, this is probably at the time during the Song Dynasty, at its peak, probably 100 million people living in China, which compared to what's going on in Europe at this time is probably like 10 to 20 times the size there. All right. So the founder of the Song Dynasty, there's a guy named Zhao Kongjin, aka Tazu. Right now, Tazu is a name that other emperors take, like Gaozu, and that they're what they call temple names. They're basically names bestowed upon the emperor, meaning great leader or great kind of man or whatever. Right. The thing about the Song that's a little different than the other dynasties is that their capital is in the city of Kaifeng, which is in the southern part, a little bit more south of the traditional capital Shenyang. This is probably the first time that the capital is not in Shenyang, which is often referred to as Xianyang or whatever like that, since the Zhou dynasty. All right, so the Song are an older kind of family. They had vied for the mandate dating back to the Warring States period, which the Qin eventually had won. All right, there's and then this is the kind of like the geography of the Song dynasty. Geographically, not as large as the Tang dynasty. Majority of the kind of urban centers are still in the east, right, between the Yellow and the Yangtze River. There's my man Zhao Kongjin. There's a martial arts that's named after him called the Long Fist of Zhao Kongjin. Whether he had a hand in its creation or it was named after him, but there's some stories on him being pretty athletic. This is a painting of him playing a sport called Kuju, which has been documented in China and Japan. It's like a precursor to soccer, right, like football there. So there's my man, Zhao Kongjin. Looks like he's got some skills. He's got some handles, all right. Like I said, for the most part, the Song dynasty is often compared to the Tang dynasty. They still engage in the kind of the civil service examination based on teachings of Confucius. They're still urban centers. They're still basically this idea of kind of trade and that. But the thing that historians like use to separate the two is that this is often referred to the age of kind of invention. It is debatable. There's some inventions there that some historians claim actually started in the Tang dynasty, but the three that generally the consensus are gunpowder, movable type, and magnetic compass are all three inventions that are kind of credited to China during the Song dynasty. And these are not just inventions that are important to just the Song or the Chinese. These are world revolutionary. All right, they change the nature of warfare, they change the nature of information, they change the nature of travel and exploration. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a series of videos here that talk about the inventions of the Song dynasty. The first one talks about something that's not on there, what they believe is the first mechanical clock here. All right, this is an image here of Kaifeng, just to kind of show you the city itself.
This is Kaifeng City, 400 miles south of Beijing. Around 960 AD, one of China's golden ages blossomed here into the Song dynasty, a 300-year period ripe with innovation. Kaifeng was the dynasty's first capital. This city of nearly 4.5 million people has been an important center of Chinese civilization for about 3,000 years. But even today, the city retains many features specific to the Song dynasty's culture. At 7 o'clock each night, the city's food market sets up in a mad rush, each vendor hoping to be the first to dish up his wares. This tradition of eating out began during the Song dynasty, when expanding commerce brought money and people to the capital. The world's first restaurants sprung up, and food like dumplings and noodles became widely available to the masses for a small price. The architecture in Kaifeng's new historic district is based on the style of the Song capital. This temple lies at the northern end of the city's historic district. It was built in honor of emperors who ruled Kaifeng during its imperial days. The location was chosen because buried far below this building are the ruins of the Song imperial palace. This is a model of the ancient palace grounds. Hidden among the impressive walls and buildings is one of mankind's greatest inventions, a 30-foot tower the inventor called a cosmic engine, the world's first mechanical clock. This scene is a monument to one of the greatest breakthroughs of intellectual history. The fellow on my left here, Su Song, was a mathematician, astronomer, and all-round genius who's explaining his invention a mechanical water clock, to the Emperor Chap in the year 1092. Early Chinese astronomers often equated the heavens with water, since stars seemed to drift across the night sky like a giant flowing river. They frequently used water to drive simple machines, which mimicked the motion of the stars. The problem they faced was keeping the mechanism operating at a precise rate. Susung solved that problem with a mechanism which today is known as a mechanical escapement. Inside Susung's armillary clock, a stream of water turned a large wheel equipped with cups. As the measured weight of water forced one cup down, the wheel moved forward one cog. A series of weights and locks kept it from recoiling or from moving forward too quickly. This mechanical escapement captured time in precise increments. A chain drive, another Chinese invention, rotated the armillary at the top. One complete rotation for each day, replicating the movement of the stars. Although this machine was primarily used as an astronomical showpiece, its mechanical escapement was the foundation of modern mechanical clocks. In a few hundred years, China would drop this technology while the West, much later, went on to create clocks using weights and springs instead of water to drive the escapement. Modern China's distinctive identity has evolved over thousands of years. It is one of the oldest and most successful civilizations, a society whose strength depended on science and technology. In fact, from 600 to 1500 AD, China was the most technologically advanced society on Earth. Like all budding cultures, the Chinese gathered knowledge through careful observation and experimentation. They watched the endless cycles of the sun, moon, and stars, and marveled at the force of nature. Over millennia, their understanding of the elements grew, and the Chinese found ways to harness the powers of earth, metal, wood, water, and fire. Normally, we think of fire as a destructive element, but it can also be a force for creation. Early Chinese alchemists believed the secret to eternal life and powerful medicines lay in combining just the right ingredients over a fire. Some recipes even called for heating concoctions up to a year. Around 300 AD, the alchemists began to create elixirs of sulfur, saltpeter, and various plants. It took another 700 years of singed beards and charred houses before researchers learned to add pure charcoal to sulfur and saltpeter. Blending the three made what they called huo yao, the fire drug. By sheer coincidence, they discovered gunpowder. The new invention created bright sparks, and so the Chinese used it for celebration. They invented the world's first fireworks. After fireworks, it didn't take long for gunpowder to find its new destiny: war. For thousands of years, arrows were the primary weapon in Chinese warfare. But so you can thank the Chinese for your 4th of July light show.
Thanks, Chinese. And then this one's on paper with left, right?
For nearly 35 centuries, the Chinese have kept carefully dated, detailed, and reliable records. This is Jinhua village in central China. It is in this bucolic atmosphere that I find remnants of another ancient Chinese technology that dates from the 2nd century BC: paper. Villagers here in Jinhua earn their living by making paper the traditional way, sheet by sheet. Gathering the material they use to make paper is as simple as going into the backyard. The villagers use bamboo, which grows in abundance on these mountainsides. Workers cut the bamboo down, dry it, and chop it into chips. Then they steam the chips until they're crumbly and moist. Next, the bamboo is soaked in bleach and ground into a thick mush. Once the mush is white, they grind it again into liquid pulp, perfect for paper. 3 centuries ago, the process took 100 days. Now it takes a week. Once they've suspended the pulp in a vat of water, they use screens to gather a thin layer and then lay the new paper out to drain with one sweeping, elegant motion. This family has been making paper here for 14 generations, nearly 300 years. In the beginning, paper wasn't anywhere near as thin as these sheets drying on the wall. In fact, people used the earliest paper to make blankets and clothing accessories. Eventually, the Chinese refined the process and created a smooth, thin material, ideal for writing. 1,000 years later, long before the West had even started making paper, the Chinese were already working on a new idea, the printed word. Printing was an idea that flourished around 1000 AD, once again during the Song dynasty. From then on, information could be easily duplicated and distributed. This is Qingming Riverside Park in Kaifeng. You can look beyond the tourists with their video cameras and their cell phones. Every detail in this park, the architecture and the costumes, is an exact replica of what life was like here in the 11th century. I'm here because scattered throughout this park are hints of China's technological past, at a time when Kaifeng was a lively centre of trade and commerce. And the reason why this park is so authentic is because it was modelled after a 16-foot-long scroll by artist Zhang Zeduan. He captured a snapshot of ancient Kaifeng during his lifetime, detailing Song lifestyle, costume and architecture. Today the park is one of the few places where ancient tools and techniques are still alive, including the first methods of print, a simple process which revolutionized the intellectual world. What we're seeing here is the process of printing from a woodcut. Now, all a woodcut is a piece of wood with the image you want carved in reverse. You take ink, apply it to the wood, put on your piece of paper, apply pressure, and you have a printed image. Having come up with the woodcut, the Chinese then ran with the idea. They made small woodcuts with individual characters inscribed on the back. They had invented, in other words, movable type. It was another critical invention that arose during the Song dynasty. But the reason movable type didn't take off in China was that instead of using a few dozen letters, they used thousands of characters, each one representing a different word. This obstacle limited the use of movable type, but printing continued. It was in China that the information age truly began. By 812 AD, the Chinese had combined two of their greatest innovations, paper and printing, to produce a third. It comes in all shapes and sizes, makes the world go round, and it is, of course, paper money. Now, the Chinese called it flying money because it flew out of their pockets, which is a problem I still have. However, it was destined for a very long career. Western Europe got its first printed money in Sweden in 1661. The US wouldn't see printed money until 1690.
And the last one here is on the magnetic.
The power of wind has made its mark on Earth since the beginning of time, turning rock into sand, churning oceans, and repainting the landscape of the sky. The ancient Chinese carefully observed that power, and 2,300 years ago, they invented a way to harness it. Early kites were shaped like birds, but today their designs are limited only by the imagination. The first kites were used by the military to intimidate their enemies and drop messages of propaganda behind enemy walls. There were even stories of kites powerful enough to lift human beings. I went to Weifang, a city in northeast China, in search of traditional handmade kites. The artists make kites in the traditional way. They heat slices of bamboo and shape them into the skeletons of flight. The exotic frames are glued together and covered with a thin layer of silk, which becomes the skin of the kite. But it's the bright acrylic paint that brings the silk dragon heads to life. This kite is more than 100 feet long, with approximately one disc per foot.
Very, very strong.
Segmented kites like this generate more lift because each segment adds wind resistance, so that even a mild gust can easily lift this monstrous dragon. But the most important lesson the ancient Chinese learned from kite technology was how to ride the wind.
For the greater part of the history of sailing, the technology of Chinese sailboats has been drastically superior to anything that any Westerner had. Much of that superiority lay in the sails. This is called a batten sail. The battens are the strips of bamboo, and the advantage of them is that they give mariners great flexibility. If the wind is strong, they can only raise 1 or 2 battens. If the wind is weak, they can raise them all.
The parallel battens keep the sail from billowing out too far and losing thrust. Another revolutionary innovation was aligning pivoting sails along the axis of the boat, so they could catch the wind from different directions.
In the West, the sails tended to be at right angles with the boat, and that meant they could only sail properly when the wind was behind them. But with this, you could sail with the wind in 3/4. If it looks familiar, that's because every modern Western yacht you've seen has copied this design.
The West borrowed other Chinese maritime innovations: rudders to steer ships, leeboards to reduce downwind drift, and watertight compartments to keep boats afloat, even if the hull was breached. Chinese officials in court rituals faced the emperor just as the other stars faced the North Star, so they built their imperial palaces with the throne room facing south. From the palace to the sprawling empire at its feet, imperial cities like Kaifeng were built on a precise north-south axis. The ancient Chinese invented something to guide them in finding north-south lines: the magnetic compass.
Originally, compasses pointed not north, but south, and the original compasses looked like this. By the 4th century BC, Chinese alchemists had discovered the properties of lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic material which, if left free to spin, would align itself with the Earth's magnetic field.
These early compasses were called south pointers because the spoon-shaped lodestone always pointed south. Chinese sailors found the compass indispensable on water. By the 12th century, large fleets of Chinese junks were roaming the Earth, sailing as far as Africa.
Before it could be used on a ship, the south pointer needed a little finessing. It will work fine on a perfectly calm day, but with a little wind or a little bucking of the deck, it'll swing around wildly and it's next to useless. Now, at some point, someone figured out that you can use a lodestone to magnetize a plain, ordinary piece of iron. You take an iron needle, rub it with a magnet, it will behave exactly as a lodestone would. You then stick that needle through a piece of bamboo, float it in a bowl of water. You have, in effect, a modern compass. It will align itself north to south. Now, it might not look like much, but with this, you don't need the sun and the stars. No matter how dark and stormy the night, no matter how bad the weather, you can always find your way home.
So this is a compass, a magnetic compass that dates back to the Ming Dynasty, which is a later dynasty in Chinese history. The Ming are going to benefit from the magnetic compass. Like they mentioned how the Chinese had made their way to Africa. There was a admiral by the name of Zheng He, who sailed for the Ming, that went to the Swahili coast and brought back a giraffe. There's a book that was put out about 15 years ago called 1421, which claims that the Chinese, with Zheng He, the admiral during the Ming Dynasty, actually reached what is now modern-day California, some 70 years before Columbus did, but they didn't make a settlement. They didn't make a settlement there. It's still debatable, all right, if you will. But at one point, they kind of turned inward. But this is going to kind of change seafaring. All right, it's going to replace the astrolabe, and without the magnetic compass, you don't have the age of exploration, Columbus and such. Also, the thing that kind of started in the Song Dynasty, not as important, but it was kind of something that's like kind of focused on kind of culturally here. This is a picture of a Chinese woman in, and you notice like this is like the early part of the 20th century. Her feet are really, really tiny. There was a custom referred to as foot binding that started during the Song Dynasty, where you would have certain women of a particular class, upper class, that while they were born, they would essentially kind of break their feet, all right, and they kind of wrap them and they kind of prevent them from growing, all right. Now, why would you do that? This was kind of done on a couple of reasons. One, it was viewed as aesthetically pleasing, attractive, all right. And different cultures have different views what they think is like attractive. Some of the stuff that we do here, but other cultures may think it's kind of odd. Another thing for certain men, if you had a wife whose foot who had feet binded, it was a status symbol. Not only was that attractive, but also too, she probably wouldn't be able to do the traditional housework that was kind of expected. So you would have to hire servants. So that was kind of showed your kind of status. Now, it fell out of favor after the Song Dynasty, and then was brought back in the early part of the 20th century in China in rural areas. All right, and so there was still like Miss Lindauer was in China in 2000. She brought back these little like shoes. They look like baby like shoes, you know. And so there's women today in China. They're probably in their 90s, and now this isn't common custom like today, but it was kind of brought back in the kind of early part of the 20th century. So. Unfortunately, you see the kind of like the woman's foot on the right is basically formed to the shape of that shoe, if you will. But this is something that was done for aesthetic purposes and for like kind of like a status symbol, if you will. And that started in the Song Dynasty, but fell out and then kind of came back in the early part of the 20th century. All right. Also, too, the Song Dynasty, like I said, continued that civil service examination for government jobs based on the teachings of Confucius. When we start to see the Song, we start to see more and more people kind of taking those tests, a kind of larger bureaucracy, and a kind of a class of people that in the West we refer to as literati. In China, they refer to as jinsi, which was the name of the Chinese name for the exam. All right, and so you would have some people that they would take that test that could elevate their social status and their status for their family. You had others that would basically pass down these civil service gigs to their sons and grandsons. They didn't necessarily have to take the test, but if you wanted to take the test at the highest level, which was jinsi, the highest level where you get a kind of good government position, you have to take the test. All right, but they developed a kind of class within the middle class there, basically and this is where with the access to printing and more books and stuff like that, that education became a kind of a viable economic kind of like a career, if you will. All right. However, for Confucianism, which was basically what you kind of needed to kind of like learn to take these tests, for everyday people, Confucianism was probably a distant third when it came to kind of religion and philosophy to Buddhism and Taoism. So as a result, we start to see some Confucian scholars tweak the concepts of Confucianism a little bit. In the West, they refer to as Neo-Confucianism, all right, which mixes Confucianism with the other popular religions and philosophies, Buddhism and Taoism, but at the same time, still holding on to certain tenements of the original Confucian thought. What we would find is there's a little bit more like kind of mixing of like terminology that was used in Buddhism and Taoism, all right, like things like karma and stuff like that, but also a idea of what we call metaphysics that was kind of added into there. That in Buddhism and Taoism, it kind of advocates for people to kind of separate from society, become more individualistic. Like Buddhism, the idea like this world isn't really real, all right? Confucianism, that was a little bit too far a step to take. So Confucians believed that you had to basically kind of interject yourself in society, be a solution to a certain extent, all right? But they did hold on to this idea that your kind of core, your way, if you will, your Tao, could have effect on how you kind of behave within society. All right, so this is what they often refer to as the kind of golden age of kind of Chinese philosophy during this period. However, again, Confucianism still was kind of a third on the belief system there, but you still find this today in China, mixing and matching of religions and philosophies. Like all these dynasties, though, the mandate of heaven is lost at some point, and so probably starting in the kind of like the 12th into the 13th century, we start to see. Like the dynasty split into a northern and southern Song dynasty. One part of the northern Song dynasty was basically integrated into what they call the Lao dynasty, which was established by a Turkic people called the Kitians. Later, that region is going to be taken over by another people called the Jurchens, who established the Jin dynasty, which they controlled Beijing at the time. The Tartars are going to kind of occupy the area directly north of the Song. The Tartars are kind of a nomadic culture, horse culture. We'll talk about them again when we talk about Russia. Later, the Mongols are going to outsource kind of like control of Russia to the Tartars. And then we have two other groups, the Tenguts, who established their own dynasty just west of there called the Jia dynasty, or the Western Jia. They were the ones who kind of controlled the horse trade within China there, so they had a little bit of influence. And then a group directly to the west in the very mountainous regions are Tibetans, which today we know the Tibetans, the most famous Tibetan probably is the Dalai Lama. This is prior to the basically full acceptance of kind of Buddhist theology. Before that, they were like a kind of standard kind of semi-nomadic, nomadic horse culture. Now, people don't tend to focus on these groups as much, but they're all kind of pushing on the fringes of the Song dynasty, because there's another group that has basically the kind of the superheroes of the superstars of the nomadic world, and that's the Mongols, who we'll talk about on Tuesday. All right. Did you guys get this? My phone ring?
Yes.
All right. I'll see you guys. I'll stop recording now.
I have a quick afternoon announcement. Next week, to celebrate Black History Month, we are having dress-up days. On Tuesday and Wednesday, it's Black Panther Day. In honor of Chadwick Boseman, the